Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments section before we start. Together, let's now explore the past's shadows. The year is 1911. North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains rise silently over seemingly infinite deep valleys and lush forests. The area continues to aggressively protect its secrets today. Communities are isolated from one another, and the roadways are merely dirt trails. Another, separated by rugged mountains and miles of impenetrable forest. This place has not yet experienced the modernism that is already starting to change the major cities in the East. Ancestral customs endure like specters of the past in these highlands, where time seems to pass more slowly. When Elizabeth Ward's story started to entwine with the mystery that would plague these mountains for decades, she was 23 years old. She was a plain-looking young lady with brown hair that was always pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that many people described as agitated. Elizabeth, her husband Thomas Ward, and their 2 kids resided in Buncombe County on a tiny farm close to the town of Asheville. The daily battle for existence and the ongoing labor on the land characterized the difficult life there. While Elizabeth took care of the house, the kids, and a little garden that hardly provided food for the family during the coldest winter months, Thomas worked as a lumberjack, spending whole days in the nearby forests. However, there was something intriguing about Elizabeth. Her nearest neighbors. She was said to be a reserved woman who hardly smiled and appeared to bear an unseen burden. When the local women got together on Sundays at the little Methodist church, they would mutter about Elizabeth's aloof stare and how she would occasionally remain motionless for extended periods of time, gazing at the distant mountains as though she was waiting for something or someone. Naturally, there were rumors. In small remote communities, rumors are a constant. Some stated, Elizabeth was a practitioner of ancient arts, and on new moon nights she had conversations with spirits. Others asserted that she had never really recovered from the death of her 3rd child, who had been born 2 years prior. The 1910-1911 winter was especially harsh. The mountains were covered with snow at a depth not seen in years, and families were left stranded on their properties for weeks at a time, feeling even more alone. The first indications of what was to happen started to show at this time. Thomas Ward informed the proprietor of Elizabeth was ill at the sawmill where he worked. He claimed that she had started talking to herself at night, was seldom eating, and spent hours gazing out the window. The dad was obviously concerned, but family things were taken care of at home in that era and location. There were no specialist physicians in the area, and getting outside assistance was frowned upon. Something clearly changed at the Ward home in February 1911, when the snow finally started to melt and the trails were once again usable. The closest. Around 2 miles distant, neighbors remarked that they were no longer able to see smoke rising from the chimney during the day. This was peculiar because winter was coming to an end, but the temperature was still low enough to need a fire all the time. Jeremiah Foster, one of the neighbors, made the decision to make a courtesy call and brought extra firewood and some supplies. Everything will be different after he got to the Ward property. There was total silence in the house. No kid-playing noises, no commotion from cleaning. Jeremiah repeatedly pounded on the door, requesting Elizabeth and Thomas. Nobody responded. As he strolled around the property, he noticed that only his own tracks were visible in the snow surrounding the home. The small coop's chickens were dead, perhaps from cold and starvation. There was a serious problem. Jeremiah's heart was racing as he pushed open the door, which gave way with ease. He instantly recoiled at what he saw inside that pitch-black, frigid area, tripping over his own feet and plunging into there's snow outside. Thomas Ward sat still in a chair by the dark fireplace. The death that had occurred days or maybe weeks earlier had left his body frozen and inflexible. However, Jeremiah had been frightened by more than that. Elizabeth was gone, and the kids were also present, grouped in a way that appeared almost deliberate. With trembling knees and a racing heart, Jeremiah Foster hurried back to his land. He had to notify the authorities, but the closest police station was in. Over 15 miles distant, on still muddy trails from the melting snow, is Asheville. William Hawthorne, the Buncombe County Sheriff, had to assemble a group of men and travel to the Ward property for almost a whole day. By the time they arrived late the following afternoon, the sun had already started to set behind the mountains, obscuring the sight they were about to see with long, menacing shadows. As a veteran, Sheriff Hawthorne had seen his fair share of mountain fatalities. That was a tough, unforgiving area where accidents were common. Hunger, the cold, and illnesses that could be cured in the cities killed people. However, even he experienced a chill when he walked into the Ward home and saw what Jeremiah had described. Thomas Ward remained seated as though he were just relaxing, but his glassy, wide eyes conveyed a different message. The two kids, a 3-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy, lay in their blanket-covered beds as though everything had been thoughtfully arranged for them, to doze off indefinitely. There were no overt indications of violence, such as bloodstains, markings of a struggle, or broken objects that would have suggested a confrontation. In its deathly silence, the house was nearly peaceful, oddly ordered. However, Elizabeth Ward's absence made this tragic family tableau considerably darker and more unsettling. The sheriff and his men started going through every room of the little wooden house, turning over furniture, opening drawers, and looking for clues. One of the bedrooms was where it was, and thought they discovered something that would make the mystery much more difficult to solve. There was a little wooden trunk beneath the bed that Thomas and Elizabeth shared. Elizabeth's clothes, a wooden comb, a small cracked mirror, a worn leather-bound journal, and a few personal items were all neatly wrapped within. With shaking hands, Sheriff Hawthorne picked up the journal and started looking through it. Some of the comments on the sheets were dated months ago and were written in a tense, cramped script. The majority of the words were written quickly and were hard to understand. Some lines sprung out of the pages like silent screams, or maybe during times of intense emotional upheaval. "They won't stop looking at me," stated a December 1910 entry. Even more unsettling was another entry, this one from January 1911. "Thomas doesn't believe it, but I know they're there in the trees waiting." The kids have also begun to notice them. They point at the window when they awaken in the middle of the night. I can no longer keep them safe. I have no idea how. He then explained what needed to be done to me in one of the final readable notes, written in a handwriting that appeared more and more desperate. They can only be saved in this way. In any case, the cold will take them. It's better this way. My hand is preferable to theirs. Feeling the weight of those words, the sheriff carefully closed the diary. What did Elizabeth think she saw? Who were they? And above all, what had actually transpired in that house over those protracted weeks of winter seclusion? There were no answers. However, one thing was becoming more and more obvious. This had not happened by chance. Even the person who knew and loved the victims had arranged those killings, and that person had vanished into the huge, merciless Appalachian highlands. The search was organized by the sheriff's men. Elizabeth Ward might be in danger, lost in the mountains, or hurt somewhere far away, so they needed to find her in order to comprehend what had occurred. The temperature remained sufficiently low to be deadly at night, and the higher ground was still covered in snow during the day. Volunteers from nearby towns, men who were familiar with every route, valley, and cave in the region, formed search parties. Calling Elizabeth's name, they searched miles of impenetrable forest for any indication that she had been there, even footprints. Weeks passed. The hunt went on, but as time went on, there was less chance of finding Elizabeth alive. Some started speculating that she might have fallen from one of the several, that she might have been attacked by untamed animals, or that she might have fallen between precipices that cut through the mountains. Darker theories were held by others, particularly by those who had read passages from the journal. They claimed that Elizabeth had gone absolutely insane, that she had harmed her family, and that she had run away to die in the mountains by herself, overcome with regret and shame. However, over 3 weeks after the deaths were found at the Ward home, something occurred that would fundamentally alter the investigation's trajectory. A hunter named. On the slopes of Mount Mitchell, the highest Appalachian mountain east of the Mississippi River, Samuel Pritchard was tracking deer footprints when he observed something strange. There was a little hut there, an antique building that may have been occupied decades ago by miners or hunters. Samuel was familiar with the cabin. On his trips he had previously passed it, but this time smoke was rising from its improvised chimney. Samuel Pritchard approached the cabin warily, his weapon firmly grasped in his palms. Hikers and traveling laborers frequently used these deserted buildings as a makeshift refuge. But he felt concerned about the situation for some reason. The cottage was situated on a ridge where the snow was deep and the cold was still stinging, at least 15 kilometers from the main trail. Whoever was inside had picked one of the most remote and difficult-to-reach locations in the whole area on purpose. Samuel identified himself as a local hunter and yelled out when he was close enough. There was no response. Except for the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, the mountain was silent. Now that he was getting closer, he saw that the cabin door was ajar and swinging a little in the cold air gusts. With his heart racing, Samuel opened the door and looked inside. He quickly backed away at what he saw, almost tripping over a path covered in snow. Elizabeth Ward was sitting in a corner of the cabin, crouched on the dirt floor. Her appearance was startling. Yet she was alive. She had a thin face and eyes. Her lips were discolored and brittle, sunken in their sockets. Her bare feet were clearly frostbitten, and her garments were ripped and filthy. The expression on her face, however, was the most unsettling. Samuel's presence did not appear to startle or intimidate her. Rather, she gazed at him with a strange serenity, as though she had been anticipating his coming, as though this were all a part of some unfathomable scheme. Samuel made an effort to speak with her and inquire about her well-being and assistance needs. Elizabeth simply trembled. Slowly, as though the question was nonsensical, she said something he didn't quite comprehend. The words seemed disorganized and unconnected. Samuel knew he had to do something. After removing his own coat and covering Elizabeth's shaking shoulders, he assisted her in standing up. She didn't aggressively cooperate, but she also didn't resist. Without a will of her own, she moved like a doll, letting her be led. It took hours to get down from the mountain. For a while, Samuel had to practically carry Elizabeth, particularly when her fatigue got to be too much. After a few minutes of unconsciousness, she would awaken and carry on walking as if nothing had occurred. She just uttered mumbles and incoherent phrase fragments the entire way, never saying a single meaningful word. Samuel started to realize that he was doing more than simply reuniting a lost woman. He was returning a person who had transcended an imperceptible barrier and who might never fully come back. It was already late when they finally reached Asheville. Sheriff Hawthorne was both relieved and upset to see Elizabeth, so Samuel escorted her straight to his office. What was the state of her life? The sheriff summoned Dr. Henry Calloway, a local doctor, who examined Elizabeth in one of the cells that had been temporarily transformed into a makeshift bedroom. The first diagnosis was bleak: severe malnourishment, hypothermia, potential irreversible frostbite damage to her feet, and what the physician, characterized as a severe mental disorder. However, Sheriff Hawthorne required clarification. He had to know what had transpired in that remote mountain house. The sheriff tried to question Elizabeth after she was given basic medical attention, fed, and warmed. He sat in the chair next to her bed and started asking questions in the softest voice he could manage. Where was Thomas now? What had become of the kids? She had run to the mountains, but why? With those vacant eyes, Elizabeth turned to him and started talking. However, her responses weren't really clear. It was a perplexing jumble of disjointed recollections, hallucinations, and partial admissions that were incongruous with one another. She described voices calling to her at night, figures in the trees, and an internal, rather than external, cold. She claimed that she had taken the necessary precautions to keep her family secure, and that she had tried to keep them safe. However, when the sheriff expressly inquired about her actions, Elizabeth would either go quiet or erupt into unrestrained tears. There was more uncertainty than clarity in the days that followed. After re-examining Elizabeth, Dr. Calloway declared that she had melancholy mania, a phrase used at the time to characterize serious mental illnesses that we would now recognize as profound dissociative episodes or potentially psychotic breaks. He suggested that she be moved to the more than 250-mile-away North Carolina State Hospital in Raleigh for mental health care. However, the sheriff had to determine whether to formally prosecute her with the offenses she had allegedly committed before that could take place. Meanwhile, a forensic physician from Charlotte eventually conducted a more thorough examination of Thomas Ward's and the children's bodies. The case was further clouded by what he found. Poisoning was evident, but there were no overt indications of physical abuse. Traces of a material that the physician determined came from nearby plants, particularly the roots of water hemlock, a very poisonous shrub that proliferated in the area's swampy surroundings. Death would have been gradual and excruciating, but in a setting without proper medical monitoring, it might have been misdiagnosed as the signs of a common sickness. Everything was altered by this finding. Elizabeth hadn't only led her family to perish from neglect or cold. She had poisoned her spouse and her own children with premeditation and purpose. There was nothing Sheriff Hawthorne could do. 3 murder charges would be officially brought against Elizabeth Ward. Like wildfire, word of Elizabeth Ward's arrest traveled throughout the communities of the Appalachian Mountains. It was nearly incomprehensible that a mother could do something so heinous in an area where everyone knew one another and families had coexisted for generations. People congregated in grocery stores, churches, and the few businesses dispersed across the towns to talk about the case in terrified, hushed tones. Some defended Elizabeth, claiming that she must be under the influence of something wicked, that no, such an act would be possible for a woman in her right mind. Others were less forgiving, accusing her of being a witch and a monster, and called for prompt and harsh punishment. The Buncombe County Courthouse in Asheville planned to host the trial in May 1911. Elizabeth Ward was kept apart from the other inmates in a dedicated cell during the months before the trial. Due to her 2 suicide attempts, she was constantly watched. The first time she had attempted to hang herself with her dresses ripped shreds. The second time, using a piece of metal that she had freed from the bed frame, she attempted to open her wrists. The realization that Elizabeth Ward was genuinely lost in a world of suffering and sorrow from which she would never be able to escape grew with each try. Robert Ashwood, a young, aspirational prosecutor appointed to the case, regarded this high-profile trial as a chance to establish himself nationwide. He gathered statements from neighbors, collected tangible evidence, and built a case over the course of several weeks. Story that depicted Elizabeth as a cold-blooded murderer who had carefully prepared to eradicate her own family. Ashford would contend that the journal entries, which at first glance were seen as evidence of insanity, were actually proof of premeditation, demonstrating that Elizabeth had deliberated her course of action for weeks before acting on it. Marcus Flynn, a local lawyer in his 50s who had successfully defended many challenging cases over his career, was in charge of Elizabeth's defense. Flynn was aware of a nearly insurmountable conflict. The public's opinion was strongly slanted against Elizabeth, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. His only chance was to claim insanity in order to demonstrate that Elizabeth was so mentally ill at the time of the acts that she was not legally accountable. It was a dangerous tactic because, even if it succeeded, Elizabeth would probably be committed to a mental institution for the remainder of her life, a destiny that many saw as worse than death. When the day of the trial eventually came, the courtroom was packed. The benches were packed with people who had come from all around the county, while others gathered outside in anticipation of any potential news leaks. Abraham Patterson, a severe and well-respected individual who had been on the court for more than 20 years, presided over the case. He gave a long address to begin the session, stressing the need of maintaining decorum and order during the proceedings and the gravity of the case. 2 guards escorted Elizabeth inside the courtroom. Many people in attendance were taken aback by her appearance. During her incarceration, she had dropped even more weight, and her thick dark hair had been chopped short, revealing early gray streaks. Her hands were shackled in front of her, and she was dressed simply in gray. She sat next to her attorney without glancing at the throng or making eye contact with anyone. As though she was seeing something that no one else could, her gaze stayed focused on a far-off spot. Ashwood, the prosecutor, made his case with surgical accuracy. He called one witness after another. Foster Jeremiah detailed the incident he had seen at the ward home in unsettling detail. The forensic physician provided a technical explanation of the poisoning's cause, the victim's duration of suffering before passing away, and the onset of the symptoms. Samuel Pritchard described his meeting with Elizabeth in the isolated cabin, her strange serenity, her inaudible whispers. But it was Ashford's display of Elizabeth's diary that really brought the gathering to its knees. He read a few passages out loud, giving special attention to sentences that implied purpose and preparation. "Better by my hand than by theirs," he read, as the throng let out a horrified groan. Ashford contended that these statements demonstrated Elizabeth's complete awareness of what she was doing, and her deliberate, although troubled, decision to end her family's life. Marcus Flynn, the defense lawyer, had an almost insurmountable assignment. He called Dr. Calloway during his shift to provide testimony regarding Elizabeth's mental health. According to the doctor, she had lost all sense of reality, experienced acute delusions, and saw and heard things that weren't there. The identical diary entries that the prosecutor had cited as proof of premeditation, according to Flynn, were actually proof of insanity. Elizabeth had no criminal plans. Her sick mind had warped reality, and she was reacting to it. Flynn also made an effort to set the scene for Elizabeth's life prior to the catastrophe. He summoned nearby residents who attested to the Elizabeth was clearly altered by the family's struggles, the harsh winter seclusion, and the early death of their 3rd child. He portrayed a woman who had been gradually shattered by her life's harsh circumstances and had reached a breaking point in her mind where she was unable to discriminate between safety and devastation. However, Ashford vehemently refuted each claim. He asked Dr. Calloway during his cross-examination about the boundaries of current medical understanding with relation to psychological disorders. Were they able to determine with certainty that Elizabeth was inexperienced? Did insanity and delusions totally make it impossible to plan and carry out? He pointed out to the jury that Elizabeth had endured harsh circumstances, had been able to hide in the mountains for weeks, and had shown an ability for strategic thought that didn't seem to be consistent with a total loss of reason. 6 full days were spent on the trial. Finally, the moment that everyone had been anticipating, and dread came, the testimony of Elizabeth Ward. For days, Marcus Flynn had contemplated whether or not to call Elizabeth as a witness. The risk was enormous. Her mental state was erratic and unstable. She could say something that would negate the possibility of an insanity defense altogether. However, Flynn was also aware that the jury needed to see her, hear her, and realize that they were dealing with a seriously damaged woman rather than a cunning monster. He made his decision early on the 6th day of the trial. Choice. The guards escorted Elizabeth to the witness stand. She walked slowly, as though every step took a great deal of work. Her hands were still shackled when she eventually took a seat, and she gazed at her attorney with a desperate and hollow face. There was complete silence in the courtroom. Now, even those who had remained silent during the trial held their breath, anticipating the accused's next move. Flynn started off by asking straightforward, kind questions. He questioned her. To tell him her birthplace, age, and entire name. Judge Patterson had to ask Elizabeth to speak up since her response was so quiet. Her voice remained weak, full of an apparently endless melancholy, even after she repeated her responses. After that, Flynn started to walk her through her tale, including her early years spent on a modest Madison County farm, her marriage to Thomas at the age of 18, the birth of her children, and her time spent in the mountains. Elizabeth seemed almost normal for a time, answering clearly and concisely. However, something shifted in her eyes as Flynn started inquiring about the months preceding the tragedy. Her hands started to shake. Her breathing grew erratic, and she became obviously anxious. Regarding the diary and the notes she had taken, Flynn inquired. Elizabeth took a long time to close her eyes before responding. She added, her voice a little louder now but with an unsettling confidence, "I saw them. Figures waiting and observing among the woods each night." Thomas claimed that the cold, fatigue, and my imagination were to blame. The mountains were gloomy. However, I knew they were genuine. I sensed that they were watching me and the kids. They had a desire. They desired to steal my infants. The courtroom was filled with a murmur. Silence was demanded by the judge, who slammed his gavel. Flynn went on, asking Elizabeth to clarify what she meant by figures. Who were they? When Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked straight at the jury for the first time, the members of the jury recoiled uncontrollably at what they saw. There was fear there, but there was also something more, something so intense it was almost religious. According to her, they are the ones that reside in the mountains, the old ones. When I was a kid, my grandma would talk about them. According to her, people lived in these mountains long before we did. That creatures that were not animals or humans, that observed and waited, were present. Only when I began seeing them in person that winter did I start to believe it. Although Flynn was aware that this was hurting his case, he needed to give Elizabeth a chance to speak, required the jurors to witness her extreme distress. He inquired as to what these figures had said and done to her. Elizabeth was talking more quickly now, her words flowing in an unintelligible torrent. She clarified that they didn't use words to communicate. However, I comprehended. I saw sights from them. They depicted my kids being abducted, hauled into the trees and vanishing into the shadows. They displayed a frozen, desolate Thomas. They assured me that we would be stuck there and that winter would never end. Forever, that hunger and the cold would eventually claim us anyhow. Then I heard a voice that seemed to be coming from inside my own head, telling me that there was a way to keep them safe and ensure they wouldn't suffer. Judge Patterson sat down Prosecutor Ashford before he could raise an objection. He was eager to hear everything Elizabeth had to say. "Elizabeth, did you know what you were doing when you put those roots in your family's food?" Flynn then posed the pivotal question, and Elizabeth gave him a tearful look. Pouring down her face, she muttered, "I knew I was saving them. I was certain that I was protecting them. The voice assured me that their souls would be saved if I released them before the ancients could take them. They would be painless. Away from the cold and the trees, they would sleep and wake up in a better place. I adore them. All I wanted to do was keep them safe." Voices sounded throughout the courtroom. Some yelled out of rage, while others did so out of sympathy. Women shed tears in public. Judge Patterson repeatedly pounded his gavel, battling to bring things back into order. On the witness stand, Elizabeth had passed out, sobbing uncontrollably and trembling all over. She had to be carried by guards back to her residence next to her attorney. Ashwood, the prosecutor, was aware of his opportunity. He persisted when it was his turn to question Elizabeth. He presented her with all the specifics of the offense. He questioned her about how she had gathered the toxic roots, prepared the meal, and observed her family eating while anticipating the outcome. He questioned why, if she really trusted her visions, she hadn't just taken everyone away, hadn't asked for assistance, and hadn't done anything but murder. Elizabeth made an effort to reply, but her responses grew more rambling. She kept thinking about the voices in her head, the figures in the trees, and the sheer terror that had taken over her mind. Ashwood persisted, inquiring as to why she had later run away. Why had she hidden the bodies and left them behind if she really thought she was defending her family? Mountains? Because after I finished, Elizabeth uttered in a barely audible voice. After hours of ruthless interrogation, Elizabeth's testimony left the courtroom in a collective state of shock as the guards led her back to her cell. I realized the voice had lied, that the figures had never been real, that I had killed my family for nothing, and I couldn't live with that. I went to the mountains to die too. A large portion of the audience remained seated, taking in what they had just seen. There were layers upon layers of tragedy and insanity that seemed to get deeper the more one tried to understand them. There was no clarity here. She had been forced to divulge unsettling information by Prosecutor Ashwood about how she had gathered hemlock roots from the banks of a nearby stream, boiled them, and ground them into a paste that she added to the family stew. However, even these technical details that ought to have demonstrated deliberate premeditation were provided by Elizabeth in a way so out of touch with reality that it was hard not to wonder if she was sane. The following morning, closing arguments started. Marcus Flynn stood in front of the 12 local men who made up the jury. They were all family men who had experienced the difficulties of mountain living. He spoke for more than 2 hours, painstakingly painting a picture of Elizabeth as a victim of her own mental illness. Flynn extracted every aspect of her life that could clarify, if not validate, what had transpired: the death of their 3rd child, which had happened in a traumatic setting during a challenging delivery in which Elizabeth also came dangerously close to death. The family's growing loneliness during that especially difficult winter, when they didn't see anyone for more than 5 weeks. Days became endless nights due to the extreme deprivation, gnawing hunger, bone-piercing cold, and constant darkness. Flynn maintained that Elizabeth had experienced what he described as a total mental collapse, a disconnection from reality. So profound that she sincerely thought she was shielding her family from hypothetical threats. He gave examples of similar cases. He had studied cases in other regions of the nation where mothers trapped in psychotic states and under tremendous stress had committed horrible crimes. He pleaded with the jury to take into account not just the act, but also the events that preceded it, the defendant's mental state, and the total lack of any personal benefit or reasonable motivation. As soon as Robert Ashford stood up to share his closing argument, he adopted a new strategy. Although he accepted that Elizabeth had endured hardships, lived in challenging circumstances, and may have had mental health issues, he maintained that this did not release her from accountability. Ashwood reminded the jury that those same mountains were home to hundreds, if not thousands, of families living in comparable circumstances. They experienced the same harsh winters, loneliness, and hardships. They did not, however, murder their kids. They didn't use poison, their spouses. Accepting insanity as a defense in this case, according to Ashwood, would create a risky precedent that anyone under enough stress could commit the most horrible crimes and evade punishment. The prosecutor continued by detailing the victim's agony in heartbreaking detail. Thomas Ward, who had put in a lot of effort throughout his life to support his family and who had total faith in his wife, most likely passed away without realizing why his body was failing. The defenseless kids, a boy of 5 and A. 3-year-old girls who were innocent, reliant on their mother for protection, and who only ever died at her hands. In the midst of sympathy for the accused, Ashwood reminded the jury that these victims were entitled to justice, that their lives were valuable, and that they could not be forgotten. The jury retired for deliberation late that afternoon. The hours dragged on like days. Outside the courthouse, groups formed, arguing heatedly over what the verdict should be. Some advocated for a full conviction, arguing that allowing Elizabeth to escape the maximum sentence would be an affront to the victim's memory. Others, especially some local women who knew intimately the difficulties of raising children in that hostile environment, expressed sympathy for Elizabeth, suggesting that any mother could crack under enough pressure. Inside the deliberation room, the jury faced an equally divisive debate. Some members were convinced from the outset that Elizabeth was guilty of premeditated murder and should face the maximum sentence allowed by law. Others argued fervently for the insanity defense, insisting that no sane person would commit such acts against their own family. The argument stretched into the night, then into the next day, and then into another night. Judge Patterson considered declaring a hung jury, but decided to give them more time. Finally, after nearly 48 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom quickly filled again. Elizabeth was brought in, looking even more frail and distant than before. She no longer cried, no longer visibly reacted to what was happening around her. She seemed to have retreated to some deep place within herself, a refuge where the outside world could no longer reach her. The jury foreman, an elderly farmer named Jonathan Weaver, stood up when asked. His voice trembled slightly as he announced the verdict. Elizabeth Ward had been found guilty of 3 counts of murder. However, the jury had added a special recommendation to the verdict. They asked the judge to consider the defendant's mental instability when determining the sentence, suggesting that she be confined to a mental institution rather than executed. Judge Patterson received the verdict in silence, studying the document for several minutes before speaking. He thanked the jury for their service and set the formal sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time to carefully consider the jury's recommendation and all available legal options. Elizabeth was led back to her cell without showing any reaction to the verdict. It was as if the words held no meaning for her, as if she were already beyond the reach of human justice. The 2 weeks leading up to the sentencing were marked by intense debate across the region. Newspapers in Asheville, Charlotte, and even Raleigh published articles about the case, each offering its own perspective on what should happen to Elizabeth Ward. Some editorialists argued that execution was the only appropriate response to such monstrous crimes. Others wrote long essays on the need for compassion on how society failed women like Elizabeth, leaving them isolated and without resources until something broke beyond repair. When sentencing day finally arrived, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Abraham Patterson had spent the previous 2 weeks immersing himself in legal precedent, consulting with other judges, speaking with medical experts, and even with religious leaders in the community. This was no ordinary case, and he knew his decision would reverberate far beyond the borders of Buncombe County. Patterson was known for his severity, but also for his meticulous justice. He believed deeply in the rule of law, but he also recognized that the law needed to be applied wisely, not simply with inflexible rigidity. Elizabeth was brought into the courtroom for the last time. She had lost even more weight during the weeks of waiting, and her face had the appearance of a skull covered in thin, pale skin. Her eyes, which had previously shown at least some glimmer of life, now seemed completely dull. The guards had to practically hold her up as she was led to her seat. Marcus Flynn was at her side, but even he seemed to have lost hope of reaching her in any meaningful way. She was physically present, but her mind seemed to have traveled to some distant and irreversible place. Judge Patterson began his statement with a recap of the case, methodically reviewing the facts presented during the trial. He discussed the discovery of the bodies, the evidence of poisoning, and Elizabeth's own disturbing testimony. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, the difficulty of reconciling the heinous nature of the crimes with the defendant's obvious mental disturbances. Patterson then went on to discuss the issue of criminal responsibility and insanity, explaining the limitations of 1911 North Carolina law in dealing with cases where mental illness was clearly present, but premeditation was also evident. The judge spoke for nearly an hour before finally delivering the sentence. He announced that although the jury had found Elizabeth guilty of murder, he was inclined to accept the recommendation for clemency based on her mental condition. However, Patterson made it clear that this did not mean Elizabeth would simply be released or that the crimes would be minimized. 3 innocent lives had been taken, and society demanded some form of justice and protection against future tragedies. The final sentence was pronounced in a grave and solemn voice. Elizabeth Ward would be confined indefinitely at the North Carolina State Hospital in Raleigh, in the ward designated for patients. Deemed criminally insane, she would remain there for the rest of her life unless the attending physicians determined at some unlikely future point that she had fully recovered her sanity and no longer posed a danger to herself or others. Patterson emphasized that this confinement was no less a punishment than imprisonment or execution. It was in many ways a slow death sentence, a lifetime spent in an institution forever separated from society. Elizabeth didn't react when the sentence was pronounced. She remained, seated, staring at some invisible point ahead, her hands motionless in her lap. When the guards came to take her away, she rose mechanically and allowed herself to be led from the room. It was the last time most of the people in the courtroom would see her. She would be transported to Raleigh in a closed carriage accompanied by guards and a hospital representative who would meet her. The journey to Raleigh took almost a week. The roads were poor, especially in the mountainous areas, and frequent stops were necessary for rest and food. Throughout the journey, Elizabeth barely spoke. She ate when given food, drank when offered water, but she did everything automatically as if her body was simply following basic survival instructions while her mind was completely absent. The guards accompanying her were disturbed by her silent spectral presence. One of them would later describe the experience as like carrying a living ghost. The North Carolina State Hospital was an imposing, somber structure built of dark red brick and surrounded by high walls. It had been established decades earlier to house those society deemed mentally ill or dangerous. Conditions there were notoriously harsh, even by the standards of the time. Patients were often kept in cramped cells, received minimal medical treatment, and were subjected to therapies that today we would recognize as cruel and ineffective. But in 1911, this was considered a fitting fate for people like Elizabeth Ward. She was registered upon admission as patient number 347. Her personal belongings, which consisted only of the clothes she was wearing and a small wooden crucifix that had belonged to her mother, were confiscated and filed away. She was taken to the maximum security ward where patients considered most dangerous or unstable were kept. Her cell measured approximately 3 meters by 3 meters and contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a bucket for urinals, and a small barred window that offered a limited view of the hospital courtyard. Elizabeth's first months in the hospital were documented in the institution's medical records. The attending physician, Dr. William Thornton, kept regular notes on her behavior and condition. His observations painted a consistent picture of a woman who had almost completely withdrawn from the world. Elizabeth rarely spoke, even when questioned directly. She spent most of her time sitting on her bed, staring at the wall or out the window. She refused to participate in any activities offered to patients, showed no interest in interacting with other inmates, and passively resisted any attempts to engage her in conversation or therapy. Dr. Thornton tried several approaches to reach her. He talked to her about her life before the tragedy, about her childhood, about anything that might spark some connection with the present reality. But Elizabeth remained largely unresponsive. On the rare occasions she spoke, her words were fragmented and confused, often returning to the same obsessive themes: the figures in the trees, the cold, the voices that had guided her to that terrible act. She never expressed explicit remorse, but neither did she try to justify or defend her actions. It was as if those events had happened in another life to another person, and she was merely a distant observer of her own story. The years passed slowly within the hospital walls. Elizabeth aged prematurely, her hair turning completely white before she turned 30. Her body wasted away despite regular nutrition. It was as if she were gradually fading away, consumed from the inside out by some invisible force. Doctors who examined her periodically noted that she seemed to be suffering from a type of decline that they could not fully explain with the medical diagnosis of the time. She had no identifiable physical ailment, but she was clearly dying in some slow and inexorable way. North Carolina State Hospital records revealed that Elizabeth Ward lived there for nearly 7 years after her admission. During that time, she became a near legendary figure among the institution's staff and fellow patients. There was something about her that disturbed even those accustomed to coping on a daily basis with the most severe mental illness cases. Despite the hottest summer months, nurses reported an inexplicable chill when they entered her cell. Although Elizabeth hardly ever spoke out loud, some people said they could hear whispers coming from her room at night. Others vowed that they occasionally discovered her sitting upright in bed, staring out the window, and muttering names that were difficult for anyone to identify. During this time, Dr. Thornton kept taking thorough notes. He recorded every slight alteration in her conduct, each fleeting flash of insight, and each return to deep confusion. In September 1913, he wrote about an unusual conversation he had with Elizabeth in a particularly detailed entry. She had spoken reasonably clearly for the first time in months after waking up from a restless sleep. Thornton inquired as to whether she thought about or remembered her family. Elizabeth said that she gave them some thought after giving him a brief moment of clarity in her eyes. Every day, that she could hear them calling to her from somewhere far away, that she could see their faces all the time. Thornton began to doubt his own prior judgments regarding the case as a result of this discussion. Is it possible that Elizabeth was not just insane, but rather ensnared in a psychological torture that defied classification in medicine? He started looking into comparable cases in European medical literature, in an effort to learn more about what is now known as psychotic disorder with severe symptoms of depression. But in 1913, there were incredibly few resources and skills available. There were no proven treatments or effective drugs. Within the walls of the institution, Thornton could only watch, record, and try to offer what little solace he could. Elizabeth's story echoed as she slowly deteriorated in a rally in the North Carolina mountains. For many years, the site of the tragedy was left unoccupied. Nobody desired to purchase or even go to the location. Local communities started spreading rumors about odd occurrences they saw nearby. The empty house was described by hunters as having an oppressive presence. Despite the lack of electricity on the property, some people reported seeing lights moving in the windows at night. Others reported hearing screams that might have been the wind or something darker coming from the direction of the abandoned house. The neighbor who found the bodies, Jeremiah Foster, never completely recovered from that day's trauma. He became addicted to alcohol and spent his later years recounting the tale to anyone who would listen. The same details were always emphasized by him. Beyond the obvious crimes that had been committed there seemed to be something profoundly wrong with the place, as evidenced by the strange stillness of the house and the expressions on the victims' frozen faces. Foster passed away in 1915, only 4 years after the incidents, in circumstances that some deemed questionable, but the local physician. He attributed his death to complications resulting from liver cirrhosis. For the remainder of his life, Samuel Pritchard, the hunter who had discovered Elizabeth in the isolated cabin, also carried the burden of that encounter. Though he didn't talk about it much, he always brought up her eyes, that vacant gaze that seemed to see straight through him to something else. After a while, Pritchard moved to Tennessee and attempted to start over, away from the eerie memories of the Appalachian Mountains, at the medical facility. Everyone in Raleigh realized that Elizabeth would not live much longer as 1917 drew near. Her body was reduced to skin and bones. She spent most of her time in a semi-conscious state, halfway between sleep and something deeper, and seldom left her bed. She also required childlike feedings. Even when it wasn't necessary for his job, to be Thornton, who had developed an odd attachment to the case over the years, went to see her every day. In 1917, on a chilly November morning, a nurse named Elizabeth had not sat up in her bed in months when Margaret Sullivan discovered her awake. What was even more unexpected was that Elizabeth was talking. For the first time in years, her words seemed to form complete, coherent thoughts, and they were quiet but audible. Dr. Thornton arrived quickly after Margaret ran to fetch him, and he started frantically taking notes on everything Elizabeth said. Elizabeth talked about her upbringing in the mountains, her love for Thomas during their marriage, and the happiness she felt the first time she held each of her kids. She talked about how loneliness and despair had turned into something darker and more all-consuming, and about the fear that had grown inside of her during that final winter. She acknowledged the possibility that she had never actually seen the figures in the trees, and that the visions were the result of her ill mind, which had produced them to support pre-existing ideas. Despite her inability to forgive herself, she claimed that she had spent all these years in a state of limbo between life and death. Just pass away and put an end to the pain. Did she regret it? Thornton inquired. Elizabeth remained quiet for a long time before responding. She claimed that the word regret was insufficient to describe her feelings, that every breath served as a reminder of her past actions, and that there was a chasm inside of her where her soul should be. She claimed that in her dreams she saw her kids as they would have grown up rather than as they had passed away. She witnessed the girl marrying, the boy growing into a man, and the unborn grandchildren. She claimed that Thomas also paid her a visit, but not with. Anger was accompanied by an endless sadness that outweighed any accusation. This would be Elizabeth's final conversation. It was so clear and so heartbreaking in its candor. She slowly regained her semi-conscious state over the course of the following few hours, but something was different this time. It seemed as though she had let go of the final thread that kept her alive by at last expressing everything she had been holding inside for so long. 3 days after their final discussion with Dr. Thornton, Elizabeth Ward passed away. Early on November 23, 1917. For the first time since coming to the hospital, she appeared at peace, according to the nurse who discovered her. Her expression, which had been one of constant suffering for years, was now calm and relaxed. Her hands were calmly resting on her chest, though they frequently twitched even when she slept. It seemed as though she had at last found some sort of relaxation after years of fighting both internal and external demons. The post-mortem examination was carried out by Dr. Thornton himself, an uncommon practice for a medical professional of his caliber, but he felt a strange duty to see the case through to the end. No particular cause of death was identified by the examination. Despite being weakened by years of neglecting her body, her organs did not exhibit any symptoms of a terminal illness. As though her body had decided it had endured long enough, her heart had just stopped beating. In his concluding report, Thornton stated that Elizabeth Ward had passed away from what he termed vital exhaustion, a nebulous phrase that more accurately described the insufficiency of medicine at the time than a true comprehension of what had transpired. It became surprisingly difficult to decide where to bury Elizabeth. Her body had no family to claim it. She had no surviving siblings, and her parents had passed away years ago. Naturally, Thomas Ward's family did not want to be associated with her. It was evident that the small town where she had lived did not want her to return, even in death. She had occasionally attended services at the Methodist churchyard, but they refused to allow her to be buried in a consecrated ground, pointing to the seriousness of her offenses and the fact that religious authorities had never formally cleared her. In the end, it was decided that Elizabeth would be buried in the hospital's own cemetery, which was a small area at the back of the building where patients without families or resources were interred. There were only basic numbered headstones in place of names, and the place was desolate and unkempt. Elizabeth Ward was assigned the same number as a patient, 347. There was no service physician. Thornton went with 2 of the nurses who had been with her in her last days. As the plain pine coffin was lowered into the chilly November ground, they stood silently. However, Elizabeth's story didn't end with her passing. If anything, it appeared to usher in a new era in a book that nobody was particularly interested in reading. Staff at the hospital started reporting unsettling experiences in the weeks after her funeral. Reports of unexplained phenomena began to circulate from the cell Elizabeth had occupied. Nurses wouldn't go inside, claiming to sense an oppressive presence while by themselves. Some claimed to have heard quiet sobs emanating from the vacant space. As they passed the door, others claimed to have felt invisible hands touching them. The hospital administration made the decision to completely close the cell because they were worried about the morale of the employees and their growing disinterest in working in that wing. It became a sort of unofficial memorial to something that no one wanted to remember but couldn't forget because it was locked and left empty. Disturbing dreams were reported by patients in adjacent cells, visions of a pale, slender woman who was always looking for something in the hallways at night. The property where the initial tragedy had happened was still deserted back in the Appalachian Mountains. Time and neglect had caused the house to start to fall apart. There were multiple places where the roof had collapsed. The windows were shattered, and the surrounding area had started to be reclaimed by vegetation. However, after Elizabeth's passing, the location became the subject of more rumors. Passengers traveling through the reported seeing lights moving through the shattered windows of the destroyed house at night. Some said they could hear voices and conversations in whispered tones that filled their hearts with an inexplicable sense of dread. Nearly 2 years after Elizabeth's passing, in the winter of 1919, there was a particularly unsettling incident. Intoxicated by liquid courage and morbid curiosity, a group of young people from the area made the decision to spend the night in the abandoned house as a kind of dare. At dusk, 3 young men came onto the property, armed with flashlights and a youthful self-assurance that would soon be put to the test. Since the 3 young men fled the house before midnight, pale and shaking, and refused to discuss what they had gone through, it was never entirely clear what had actually happened inside that house that night. Eventually, though, one of them spoke up. Weeks later. No matter where his clothes were in the house, he described feeling an unnatural chill that seeped through them. He described how shadows moved in ways that had nothing to do with any light source, the majority of. Uncomfortably, he swore he could hear a woman's voice repeatedly calling out names, the same names as the Ward kids, in a tone that blended desperation and love in a way that gave him nightmares for months. Over time, Elizabeth Ward's tale turned into a local folk tale. It was used by parents to scare disobedient kids by presenting increasingly skewed accounts of what actually happened. Elizabeth was portrayed by some as a wicked witch who had traded her soul for evil power. Some depicted her as a terrible victim of forces she couldn't understand. As is frequently the case, the truth was obscured by layers of conjecture and embellishment, lost somewhere in the middle. Throughout his years at the hospital, Dr. Thornton painstakingly documented Elizabeth's case, but he never published his findings. Locked in a cabinet in his office, he kept his files confidential. Some co-workers conjectured that he had become overly emotionally involved with a patient who could never be helped, and that he had developed an unhealthy fixation on the case. Preserved. After leaving the hospital in 1922, Thornton lived out his last years in relative seclusion. He passed away in 1930 without ever discussing Elizabeth Ward in public. After being given to the University of North Carolina Medical Library, his files were mainly ignored for many years. The documents weren't found until the 1960s, when a researcher who was researching North Carolina's history of mental health treatment started to piece together the whole story. There were still a lot of details, obscure, forgotten, or purposefully left out of official documents. As the years passed, Elizabeth Ward's story gradually disappeared from the collective consciousness of North Carolina. In 1943, the house where the crimes had taken place finally collapsed during a violent storm. In the 1950s, a developer eventually bought the property and constructed a modest summer house on it without realizing what had transpired there decades before. The new building held up without any problems, indicating that maybe the ghosts that had haunted the location had at last found peace, or that they had only ever existed in the minds of those who were terrified by the tragedy. Throughout the 20th century, the North Carolina State Hospital Cemetery underwent a number of renovations. Many of the numbered headstones were swapped out for more respectable markers during a renovation in the 1970s, which included the names of the deceased when they could be found in the archives. A small, plain, bronze plaque bearing Elizabeth Ward's name was placed on her grave. Dates of birth, death, and nothing else. Nothing about her family, her epithet, or the circumstances that led her here was mentioned. Her story seemed too significant to be permanently etched, even in death. When Dr. Thornton's files were finally thoroughly examined in the 1960s and 1970s, they gave contemporary researchers an intriguing look at how mental illness was perceived and managed in the early 20th century. Modern psychiatrists who looked at Thornton's. According to the notes, Elizabeth most likely experienced severe postpartum psychosis, which may have been exacerbated by severe depression and extreme social isolation. The living circumstances, the stress of poverty and loneliness, and the trauma of losing a child in the past. Each of these would have produced an ideal setting for total mental collapse. However, a clinical understanding of Elizabeth Ward's circumstances does not lessen the tragedy of her story. 3 defenseless lives were viciously and absurdly taken. Thomas Ward never had the opportunity to get old or watch his kids grow up because he worked himself to death trying to support his family. The 5-year-old boy, named David, never learned to read or identified his own aspirations. The 3-year-old girl named Sarah was never given the chance to enjoy any of the thousands of little pleasures and sorrows that comprise a human life, including her first day of school and her first love. And despite our best efforts to comprehend her, Elizabeth herself. These deaths were caused by mental illness. She spent her last years in agony, caught between the craziness that had motivated her behavior and terrifying epiphanies that forced her to face her past. This story does not offer a simple solution or a clear lesson. There is only a somber reminder of how human frailty can result in unfathomable tragedy when it is pushed to its limits by cruel circumstances. Since 1911, the Appalachian Mountains region has undergone significant change. Roads are now paved, where there used to be only dirt trails cut through the mountains. Schools and hospitals were constructed, cities expanded, and electricity was introduced. For people who live in the same area, it is now nearly impossible to imagine the kind of harsh isolation the Ward family endured that awful winter. However, the secrets of the mountains remain. There are still isolated locations where there is complete silence, where trees loom like venerable sentinels, and where it is simple to see how solitude could turn into something sinister. Sometimes, the documents from Elizabeth Ward's trial are available for local historians and true crime fans to view at the Buncombe County Archives. To see her plain headstone, some people travel to Raleigh's Old Hospital Cemetery. The majority of people leave these encounters in reflective quiet, bearing the recollection of a tale that is difficult to put into categories. Elizabeth was more than just a villain, but she was also more than just a victim. Like all of us, she existed in the middle, capable of both deep love and awful devastation. After all these years, what's left is a somber reminder of how complicated the human condition is. When enough pressure is applied, the mind can shatter. Love has the power to transform into something else entirely. Destruction can result from protection. Additionally, there aren't always satisfactory solutions. No tidy conclusion, only the silent weight of a tragedy that reverberates through time, reminding us of our own frailty and the thin line separating life from death, compassion from cruelty, and sanity from madness. The terrifying tale of Elizabeth. One of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history is still Ward. A somber reminder that the worst horrors frequently originate from within rather than from the outside, from shattered hearts and broken minds that are unable to handle life's burdens. We appreciate your attention if you have followed us through this dark and unsettling case thus far. Narratives such as these serve as a reminder of the significance of comprehending not only the offenses, but also the intricate human situations that, occasionally, result in them. If you're interested in learning more about historical mysteries and cases that defied their time, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Tell us what you think of this story in a comment. Additionally, share this video with anyone you know who appreciates this kind of investigative content. We appreciate your participation in this community that aims to comprehend the most obscure aspects of